Welcome to the Relationship Recovery Podcast, hosted by Jessica Knight, a certified life coach who specializes in narcissistic and emotional abuse. This podcast is intended to help you identify manipulative and abusive behavior, set boundaries with yourself and others, and heal the relationship with yourself so you can learn to love in a healthy way.
Hello, and thank you for being here. Today, Kerry McAvoy, who you might know on Instagram, on TikTok, on YouTube, she does a ton of support for survivors and victims of narcissistic abuse. She's been on here 3 times, so you definitely, if you've been here before, you've heard her, but she's here to talk to us about cognitive dissonance. And this is a really complex topic. I'm working on another episode about this, but this is so important to understand, and it's so important to wrap your mind around because it really does help us so much when we are understanding that we don't feel like we're seeing things clearly because we're actually not seeing things clearly. We are seeing 2 things at once. And Kerry and I talk about what that looks like and how it shows up and what we can do about that. As always, you can find me at emotionalabusecoach.com, at Emotional Abuse Coach on Instagram, and you can email me at jessica@jessicaknightcoaching.com. Hi, Kerry. Thank you so much for joining me again.
Hey, thank you so much for having me back on. I appreciate it.
Can you tell us, for those who haven't listened to you on here before, a little bit about you and what you do?
Sure. Yeah, I'm a retired psychologist these days, so I don't counsel. I don't have a psychological practice these days, but I create a lot of content and I've written some books around narcissistic abuse. So I'm heavily involved with advocating healthy relationships by looking at what goes wrong in relationships so that we can get better at avoiding them, but also dealing with them when we're in the middle of one of them.
And one of the first things I ever found when I ran into your work, probably in 2021 or to early 2022, was around cognitive dissonance. And it was a term that I would see pop up on Instagram and TikTok and these other places, but I had no idea what it meant. And I think it's still a really challenging thing to understand.
Yeah, it became a passion of mine because it was what I was super duper struggling with in that relationship. I would say it was the most agonizing piece. I mean, there was a lot that was going wrong in that toxic relationship. There was, of course, the serial cheating and all this massive betrayal, but it was the confusion I felt, the inability to make a decision that kept me trapped and stuck so long. So I came across the term, interestingly, kind of a back end way. I found it when I was doing some looking into Kristen Milstead's book, Why Can't I Just Leave? It's an awesome book, by the way. I strongly recommend it. But I came across her work, and then she referenced Sandra Brown's research. And then that kind of led me down to a rabbit hole. Now I have my own book, which is a workbook called First Steps to Leaving a Narcissist. But when I stumbled onto that material, it was like, suddenly everything started to make sense to me.
Yeah. And so I wrote down before this episode, one of the descriptions that I've heard about what creates cognitive dissonance, kind of like what brings us here when we're trauma bonded. And I'm just going to read it because I'm curious what you think about it. And I think it will lead us into explaining like what it feels like. But
Sure.
basically, so this is what I think I landed on when I was struggling with it was I had to develop a coping strategy for each side of him. And there was no way for me to react to him in a universal way, except to split my experience up and cope in different ways so that I created new belief systems of how to operate in the world. And when the relationship was over, I no longer knew how to exist normally.
Wow, that's a hard description. This is how I heard Sandra Brown describe it. I mean, I've done an interview with her, so I've gotten to hear her talk about it, but I also in her book, Women Who Love Psychopaths. So think of it as a creation. You're right. It's a creation of a dual reality. There's the person that you thought you met when you first met this individual. They've created, that's during the love bombing phase. They set up their wonderful persona, which we think is the real person. We don't realize that actually is the manipulative persona. Let that one sink in. They created it to entrap you. It's not actually who they are. It's the false self, but you think it's the real self and you fell in love with that persona. So there's a second persona, which is the real self, which is sort of the Mr. Hyde piece. So you got to meet Dr. Jekyll, who in the story, Dr. Jekyll is the real person. Mr. Hyde's the false person, but it's inverse in the cases of narcissistic abuse. Mr. Hyde is the real person. Dr. Jekyll is the false person. So, but you think because of this first presentation, you met really somebody wonderful. And then you're right. You learn how to cope with the beautiful person, but you also then have to learn how to cope to survive the dark person. So you have like two sets of yourself. You split in response to their split. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And, you sometimes don't know which version you're getting in that moment, a lot of times after the bombing. But then I think that, at least in my experience, I felt like the cognitive dissonance was reinforced because they kept talking about like the other self, the good self at the beginning. They would refer to themselves with like almost like the mask on in a way. And then I'd feel double because I'd be like, we both are hoping that person seems to come back in some way. But the person that's here right now is not that person. So what am I doing?
Right. And mine did that too. He would even say, wasn't that period of time so great? I wish it was back. Can't we get it back? And then I would think, well, see, he's invested. He wants it just like as much as I do. Now I know you and I are talking him because we're in a relationship with him. It happens with women as well. But there's this pull. We often call it, sometimes we call it future faking, but there is this, or breadcrumbing, but there is this pull for us to believe in the false self is real. They do it and we do it. Now, the ironic part is if you met them under different situations with different partners, you'd find out that that persona that you met isn't actually their persona. You would see a different persona. Let me give you, for instance, my ex, if the real person who he is at the core, for example, hates animals, hates them, doesn't want a pet, really anti that. He also really loves techno music and he has other hobbies. Oh, and he's a big fan of watching airplane YouTube crash replays. Okay. That's who he really is. Doesn't spend his time very well, kind of drifty, bored easily. He's restless, an extrovert. Now, the person I met when I met him, he said he was into classical music, was a church-going guy, and, kind of more serious person, and focused and driven on his career. And I didn't, I kind of saw his history because I did a background check to see he had a lot of jump jobs a lot, but I didn't know that was an indication as a person who can't hold a job down. But I kind of thought I bought into this persona of more of a conservative, traditional person. What he was dating somebody else, and she had 5 dogs that slept with her, and she loved country music, and he hates country music. So the he that he developed with her was a animal loving, country music going, almost maybe truck driving kind of person. The person I met was conservative, driven, and loves classical music. And the person he really actually is none of those things.
Yeah. And then I'm guessing that made it really confusing when you would like think about like, well, who actually is he?
Yeah.
You can't figure it out.
Because there's 3 stages to cognitive dissonance. So when you first have this massive realization that there's something wrong, that you discover something you think violates who you thought this person was. Like he told me he was super serious about having a relationship. He'd made mistakes. He didn't want to do it again. Then I find out that he's serial cheating. That's a massive violation from that original frame. The frame of I'm a serious, driven, hard working, done a lot of work on who I am so I have better relationships. Now I'm finding out, oh, no. He's seeing many people at the same time. When you have that first massive discovery, whatever the betrayal is, it could be even that they say they want a family and then you find out that they can't. You know what I'm saying? There's some big thing that you discover that's a betrayal. Your first thought is, and I know this is what crossed my mind is, who is this person?
Yeah.
This person is a stranger. I don't know them. I thought they were this. Now I'm finding out they're that. They're not anything like what I was being presented. And that's the first stage of cognitive dissonance, is that just huge confusion over the identity of the person you're in a relationship with.
What are some things that somebody may say that's a sign that they're stuck in cognitive dissonance?
They can't make a decision. They'll literally say, I can't make a decision. I don't know why I can't leave, but I can't make a decision. I don't know what's true. I think they love me. This is what I would have said. I think he loves me. I think he says he's never, this is what he said all the time. I've never worked harder.
Yeah.
Really? And I really thought it looked like he was going to therapy. Now, I don't know if he really actually was. He may have been deceiving me. I know at least one time he stashed the phone near the therapist's office and did something else. So was he really going to therapy? Maybe not. It looked like he was going to therapy. He went to couples therapy with me. I mean, he was reading books with me in the morning and talking about relationship stuff. We did devotions together every day. It looked like he was working on the relationship. So he said, I never worked harder. I thought he meant he'd never worked harder. But yeah, when you kind of scratch below the surface, you would see signs that this actually wasn't lining up. Was he making credible changes? Was there a profound difference in the healthiness of a relationship? Was he taking accountability around his emotions and around the gaslighting? I mean, was he being more sensitive and tuning into me? No, all of that actually wasn't there. So there's the confusion. And if you asked the computer to do an impossible logical task, like literally an impossible, you gave it an equation that's not solvable, what would happen? It would just sit and spin and never come up with an answer. It can't make a decision based on something that's not actually solvable. That's what happens with cognitive dissonance with our brain. It literally sits and spins and says, but I see this, but then I see that, but I see this, but then I see that. So what's true? I don't know what's true. Doesn't compute. So literally that's why it's called cognitive. That means thinking. Dissonance means there's a something that's not adding up. There's a dissonance literally in sound is when two chords don't go together. It's creating this horrible scratching, horrible clash. We're actually having a thinking clash because both realities seem to be true.
Yeah. And then it's like, I feel, in those moments, we're trying so hard to get clear while we're most likely also being gaslit by the person at the same time.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. They are feeding into that actively because they don't want us to leave under our own conditions, under our own control. They want us to stay in the relationship until they're ready for it to be over. So they're actively feeding into this creation of both realities, partly because it keeps you thrown off and deceived. You can't make good decisions if you don't know what the truth is. So as long as they feed you what you want to hear, they know then they've gained the upper hand. But I think sometimes there's a part for some people, they do this because it's who they wish they were, but they're not being honest with themselves. I think they have. Now, am I saying narcissists have cognitive dissonance? No, I'm actually not saying that. But I do think that there is this compartmentalization. It's actually what would be called psychologically called splitting. They're doing a very primitive defense mechanism called splitting, which is they're both at the same time. There's not internal integrity. It doesn't line up inside. There's not good alignment. Because here's the thing that's fascinating. They've done research on what happens in our brain with cognitive dissonance. There's an area of our brain that's super sensitive to it. And if you have a certain type of personality, you have more of it. You suffer from it into greater degrees. And they found that narcissists, that area of the brain actually is under functioning. They don't suffer from it much. So narcissists don't particularly experience a lot of cognitive dissonance, which makes sense because you'll hear them say things like, I'm going on a diet, I need to get healthy. And the next thing you know, they've gotten into some new dessert or they're having another beer. You know what I'm saying? They actively are doing things that are out of line. You can say, yeah, but Kerry, everybody does it. Yes, but they do it a lot. If you've lived with one, you know that they're constantly, you almost feel like they're hypocrites because they're constantly invalidating the very thing they just said. Like, let's stop fighting. And next thing you know, they bring in up another argument.
Or there's
they speak out of both sides of their mouths.
Yeah. Well, I think I have a good example to kind of go off what you said about like, they may know and not know at the same time, but like, it kind of reminds me of, I had a partner that was like, I know I'm better if I move my body every day. He can handle his dysregulation or whatever. Like when I move my body, when I meditate for this amount of time, and I'm really like, no more alcohol, no, like I can't eat order out. And then it would be like, oh, well, I'm just going to go out for dinner just by myself,
Yeah. Today's
right.
Today's the exception. Only every day's the exception.
Every day is the exception, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, like, and then it would be like, okay,
Yeah.
like if you're feeling all these things, instead of calling me and being like, I need you to come over, do this thing. It's like, okay, well, did you meditate? Can you go for a walk? I'm not available right now. No, I'm not doing any. It's like, okay. It's like, and then you hold them to the thing that they're saying, and then you get in trouble. So it's like,
Yes.
but then you're sitting back and you're like, okay, well, am I being not compassionate or patient or this or that or the other thing? Or is this person actually just saying one thing, doing another, but we're left still, and I feeling crazy. But it's also when someone says, I love you, I'll do anything for you. And then they proceed to emotionally abuse you. And then, but I
call
love
you a bad name, call you name. Yeah, exactly. Call you names or go out and cheat on you again after they claim they love you and they're working on this and they've never worked harder. And yet you see them treating you with contempt or they like as if they hate you. That creates incredible confusion. You don't know which is really true. Yeah. So there's 3 stages to this. Mm-hmm. The second stage is, and you start to realize, you start to ask yourself, is this relationship worth saving? And you go back and forth and you try, and again, you get evidence to both ends. That's the problem. Both answers are true at the same time, which doesn't make sense to the brain. At times, the relationship looks like it's savable, and other times the relationships look like it's doomed and you can't make a decision. So you make no decision because no decision is clear. It would be different if someone, for example, back in my case with the serial cheater, if he just said to me, listen, I'm not going to be monogamous. Oh, that would have made it simple. I would like, okay, I'm not going to be in a relationship with somebody who can't promise that.
Right.
But instead I heard, I'm working on it. I've never tried harder. And, I love you more than you know. And or if you only knew how much I love you, I'd hear that kind of stuff. So you make no decision at all. And as it progresses and you start to deteriorate, that's the other terrible thing about cognitive dissonance is this creation of confusion in the brain is a literal state of confusion with neurological consequences.
Yeah.
So your functioning is deteriorating. You're now not remembering things as well. You're not as organized as you were. I found I struggled to speak and string words together. Here I'm a writer and I can't string words. It's awful. I would stumble over trying to think of how to say something. You might find that you're suddenly losing stuff. You're just not on top of your game, and you can see the deterioration. You can see the fact that you can't make a decision. You can see this relationship is super confusing and you're not doing anything about it because you can't see a clear path through it. And then you say, this is the last stage. You say, what's wrong with me? Mm-hmm. There must be something wrong with me. And there is. I mean, you're getting sick from the cognitive dissonance and the state of the relationship is making you sick, but you start to think there's something defective about you.
Yeah. And especially once you start to feel like you can't think clearly or do anything clearly, then I think it really amps it up because you're like, well, now I'm also making all these mistakes, right? Then maybe you get in, like I've had clients that like get into like some issues with work because they're making silly mistakes. And then now they're feeling down on themselves. But then they try and string together a conversation with a person that's hurting them and they can't articulate things well because they're so confused and gaslit. And it's like, and sometimes, I mean, people would like, I've had partners and because a few partners have said this, I know it's because I'm probably being super articulate, but they'll say like, I've had 3 people say this, you don't communicate well. And I'm always like, I literally communicate for a living. Like, I know I'm communicating well. You're trying to convince me that I'm not, but it's working because now I'm asking myself, wait, am I messing up? And so,
right. And the more devious ones, here's the other, I just had this massive aha when you're saying all this. The more devious ones, if you're in a relationship with a sociopath or a psychopath, they'll actually worsen the abuse. So mine was doing mild gaslighting, more gaslighting, like things like, boy, you're so sensitive. Are you going to let ruin the day? Those types of things, the things about outside of my feeling state, or maybe that I misheard it. But when I started to get sicker from the experience of this confusion, he then ramped up the gaslighting to use more severe forms of it that I actually he didn't say things that I thought I knew he'd said. He was saying that I didn't have a grasp on reality. So he went from, oh, your feelings are too much to now you're seeing things wrong. or that's actually not actually what happened. And so to make me feel crazier, I'm like, oh my goodness, that's so devious. And so you got to watch out for that. You may have a certain type of, not all personalities will do this. Not all types of predatory people are that sophisticated. But if you can meet somebody who's very, very good at this and sees your decline, they may then increase it. They may do more things to worsen your decline as a way to convince you that it is you and not them or the relationship.
Yeah. And so you start to look at the another way. But while this is going on, this is where that deterioration is really happening, because you can't break the confusion. And I'm sure, and Kerry, in one of our past episodes, we talked about like there's the importance of the right kind of community, because when you go to somebody who doesn't understand what you're going through, and you say like, I don't get it, they'll say like, it's so clear. And you're like, no, it's not, it's not.
I know. I even had a therapist that said it was so clear. She humiliated me so much for not being able to see it. She didn't recognize I was being gaslit that severely, that I had that I'm sure she'd never heard of cognitive. It's actually called chronic and persistent cognitive dissonance. I'm sure she'd never heard of that. And so she shamed me so much that I didn't go back.
Yeah.
She was right. She was powerfully right. But she actually said is she pointed at a table across the room and said, it's like you're asking him to get out of that chair and come sit next to you. You can't make somebody walk across the room to join you. Okay, that may have been true, but I didn't quite need it to be that blunt. I mean, I felt like I thought she was basically saying, you dumbass, wake up. But she didn't understand. I was getting mixed messages, powerful mixed messages to me that I did think I thought he was getting up and walking across the room to join me.
Right.
Seriously, I did.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, especially, I mean, I'm sure you've talked to a lot of people that had this too. It's like this person will, the partner sometimes will sit through couples therapy, will sit through these sessions. You'll have little mini breakthroughs that seem and feel real, at least in that moment. But then it goes back to, I mean, that's a cycle of abuse. It goes back to where it was again. And then you're like, but what is actually real? And, I think people that are listening to this, they could be conscious of what the cycle of abuse is, but some others might that might be the beginning of their journey and be thinking.
Yeah, they might be waking up and think, maybe.
Yeah. What does that mean?
And that's the hard part I know the hard part is determining what is actually real. That's the way to break it, is to figure out the truth. Yeah. And I really love this. I heard this from Dr. Ramani. I wish I could claim that I said this, but I didn't. I have used it because I love it. So usually it's an incremental adding up of all these little inconsistencies. And it's like these inconsistencies are like things that you're putting on a shelf that you have in your house that's not a very stable shelf. And you keep loading it with the inconsistencies. And it can just take one small thing that suddenly will breaks the shelf. And then it all comes down. And that's what it was for me. Literally, I remember having this aha, like suddenly it clicked. This is unacceptable. Why am I putting up with this? He's been mean to me for a long time. I would never allow this to be my children's experience with their adult partners. Why am I allowing it to be my experience? So I had that breaking shelf moment. And suddenly I could see and then I remember right after I had that conclusion, I looked at him and I thought, we were at a vacation and I looked around at everybody who's laughing and had a great time and loved being with each other. And I looked at him and I thought, that's not love. How could I have ever thought he loved me? He's never loved me. How could I have confused that for love? It's not love. And that for me was the beginning of the end.
Yeah. I love that description, the incremental adding up of inconsistencies. And so if somebody is like, okay, I definitely am confused, I must have this, what do I do to begin to break it? Would you say start looking at what's actually happening? Like really getting clear with your reality?
Yeah, that's what I talk about in my workbook, First Steps to Living a Narcissist. I actually have you list what is the things that they're saying and what are the things that they're doing. Because what we miss is the inconsistencies. That we know it's not adding up. We feel the dissonance, that clash. We feel that doesn't. For example, a good one that happened to me when I was dating. I was engaged. Was we had this big moment that we'd been waiting for to have like a romantic weekend. It was a big pivotal thing, and he was so excited. We made sure we took a weekend off to have it together. And then that night, he left me alone to go out and see his son supposedly for a visit at 10 o'clock at night. Well, it doesn't add up. It That's weird. That's just strange. I mean, you can't be excited about something, claim it's going to be a romantic weekend, and then ditch your date. You don't do that.
Right.
But I thought, well, he had reasons. We're getting ready to move. Might be one of the last time he gets to see this kid. He's got a strained relationship. Okay, where am I going to stand in the way of that? No, of course not. But what I failed to see was that doesn't show love. He's not excited to be with me. He's opting out to do something else instead of me. That's not what a person who's super in love, who can't wait to have something, does. That's inconsistent behavior. So what I recommend people do is write down what you see and what you're hearing and what you're experiencing, and then ask yourself, see it on paper. I think it really helps to see it on paper. Write it down like you're writing a scene for a play. Literally, he said, she said, they said. Create the scene, and then ask yourself, what here is illogical? So if you were, for example, were watching a TV show and you turned off the sound, what would you think is happening? And then turn the sound back on and read the conversation and say, does that conversation line up with what you just watched happen? So if you and I watched that scene and we had the sound off, what happened between he and I, you would say, well, that's really weird. He's not all that into her. What's going on? That's what we would have said. But if you turn the sound on and you hear what he's saying, you think, well, there's something wrong. The messaging is wrong. It's not working. He's lying. There's a deception here. You'd see there's something that's not lining up. That's how you discover it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of my grave mistakes was not explaining what cognitive dissonance is to a partner, but trying to tell them that their words and actions weren't aligned, which just led to gaslighting. But it's like that feeling of like, well, I should figure this out with them. And what I like about your answer is like, this is all about figuring this out for you. This is you figuring this out for yourself.
Exactly. That's a powerful point that you're making. And I think there's a gendered issue here. Here's where I see the difference. Because I've raised sons, so I see that they are very different than I was as a girl, and what I was like around my sisters, and how I see women doing it. Not all women are doing this, but a lot of women are doing it. Men are not taught to center the relationship first. They're taught to center themselves first. And all men do this, not good men or bad men. This is just a masculine thing to do. We do it from the get-go, from the moment they're born. Boys, did you know infant babies are male babies face outward? And moms tend to hold girl babies towards their chest. I mean, we start from the get-go. We center men in the world and women in the relationship. Anyway, so the problem is that women, unfortunately, tend to think of themselves in context as a we. What are we going to do? How am I going to solve this? Because my happiness depends on the happiness of the relationship. If the relationship's good, then I'm good. But I think this is one of those moments where, especially if you're it's going wrong, something feels off or unhealthy or not right. We need to pull ourselves back, stop thinking of the we, stop trying to save ourselves through the context of the relationship, and think of ourselves in how are we doing? What makes sense to us first, which is, for me, super foreign. I mean, it's not the way I think. I'm just naturally wired to always think of a context of the family or the couple or whatever it is. But that's the way to break it. I did the same thing. I centered the relationship to the nth degree, and he would never, I would think I'd get him to buy in, and he wasn't. He would tell me, I always likened it like the hokey pokey. He would put his right arm in and his left leg in, but he'd never put his whole self in. So when you start to see that the fact that the actions not lining with what they're saying, like that, back to the idea, if this was a TV sitcom and you watched that scene and you would come to a different conclusion, that's the truth. That conclusion is the truth, not what's being said in that sitcom.
Yeah.
That's how we break the cognitive dissonance.
Yeah. I think my example right there was about like people that are in the relationship, but I know when we're healing from a trauma bond, a lot of people are realizing this for the first time, when they're out of the relationship and they're trying to make sense of it. They're wondering if they're going to come back. Usually there's a few rounds of, maybe I did do everything wrong and maybe I didn't love them enough. And I think like that same practice of really going down of like, well, what did you do and how did you show up? And like almost doing the opposite cognitive dissonance for yourself, not just to like, not to falsely validate yourself. Like we all have things we need to work on, but to be like, no, I actually I forgave all these things and I was honest about all these, it's like really giving
Yeah.
yourself that validation that like there was no way that you could have done anything that would have
Yeah.
changed this person's behavior.
Yeah. I see most victims run the gauntlet of every possible action to save the relationship. I did.
Yeah.
Listened to podcasts, read the books, joined the groups, found the videos, went to therapy together, went to therapy alone. I mean, if I could have saved it, I knew that I would have, because I approached it in any other way that you would have approached an emergency, but it didn't save it. And there's another, I think that's another critical piece of understanding this is cognitive dissonance, because that should work. That will work. If the two people are equally invested, those efforts will work because they're both want it to work.
Right.
When you see it not working, that means somebody somewhere is throwing a wrench into something. And if you're doing all the right things, you're having the right kind of conversation starters, you're learning how to use I statements, you're learning how to take accountability for your feelings. I mean, you see what I'm saying? All these good basic skill building things that you're doing and it's not working, then it's being sabotaged.
I think that's so.
Maybe you haven't realized it, but it's being sabotaged.
I think that's so important. And that's something that I don't think I've ever thought of, is that like when you're doing all these things and this other person also claims to be doing all these things and it's not working and it's like actually nothing's really changing. Maybe it's even just getting worse. It's actually getting sabotaged. And, I remember feeling like I actually felt less safe as time went on. I was saying less of what I actually was thinking. I was censoring myself more. I didn't feel that way about what he was saying. It was almost like I was being more forgiving for like the things he was saying, because I was like, okay, well, at least he's communicating how he feels, but I'm censoring more, and so, but
I know.
Yeah.
I had a big aha. This was my big aha for me that like was, and it happened way after the relationship was over.
Yeah.
It was me. I was still, because I even hear you're still there too. I was still trying to feel like, well, did I do everything I really should have? What is it really me? In other words, I was still immersed in the cognitive dissonance post relationship. So what I did was because he was a serial cheating and he had an affair on me, I got into continue education on how to heal a relationship after an affair. Now, mind you, this was a therapist who works with loads of clients who've survived an affair. Abuse is not her topic. It's not her niche. It was recovering from an affair is her niche. So just be mindful of that. And what I heard from her was such a powerful example of what a loving person would do. If you had an affair and you really were invested in that relationship and you really loved your partner, then she outlined these steps that you would take. And I realized he took none of them, not one single one of them. And here I was doing all this work, creating the right kind of environment, being super understanding, trying to speak about it, letting him know how important he was, making him feel secure with me, on and on and on, forgiving him, letting go of the past, never doing all this great work. And he didn't bring a single thing to the table that would have healed his end of the damage.
Yeah.
And when I heard that, I realized, no, this has never been about you. This has always been about him. You did what you needed to do. But the problem was you were too nice and too accommodating and too supportive. You didn't expect more out of him. There was my error. I didn't expect more out of him. And because I didn't know to expect him to do hard work and do hard things, then I missed it. I missed it. It was all lip service.
Yeah. Yeah. You're right. And so because none of it was actually based in truth of anything. And like you didn't have evidence of it either.
Yeah.
And from
Right. Because somebody who's really working that hard on a relationship would not make me feel like crap when I'm feeling insecure and shaky. He would say, of course you are, because I broke your trust. See what he would say, like, I can't believe you can't let anything go. Well, of course I can. You did it over and over and over. So now I'm jumpy about everything. A loving, supportive person would say, honey, I did that to you. This is on me. I need to earn your trust back.
Yeah. 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 I had somebody say to me, this was like, again, typical, and no closure, no conversation. You're left sort of picking up all the pieces. And after he said, like, saw me in passing, and I was like distant and cold. And he was like, can you not be mad at me? And I was like, no, I can't not.
Actually, no, you've earned that. It's all right, dude. You've made no repair here. Yeah. Of course I'm angry with you. I don't trust you and I don't like you.
Yeah. Somebody who would, someone who cares would not.
Yeah, exactly. I had a good one.
Yeah.
Here's another great example. I had a date tell me this. The reason we didn't meet faster is because I didn't know you were so pretty. That's what he said to me. And I said, well, that doesn't feel good. I literally said, well, that doesn't feel good. And he goes, now you made me feel bad.
Oh, yeah.
But dude, you said the shitty thing first.
Right.
I'm just telling you the truth. That wasn't a nice thing to say.
Exactly.
Now I'm bad because I made you feel bad for your crappy comment. So we got to watch out for that. That creates cognitive dissonance. But when you get better at spotting the inconsistencies, you're like, no, I know 2 + 2 is 4. I'm not buying it equals 7. It equals 4.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes, I mean, we probably have to, I know the time-wise have to end after this. So I'm going to want you to share about the workbook, but this just sort of came to mind is that sometimes something really big happens that sort of cuts off a lot of the cognitive dissonance because you have this moment of being able to see like, oh my God, this is so clearly rather than these other situations that feel like, okay, what about this? What about this? What about this? And I had a client who discovered that this person or her ex had opened up a secret bank account and completely cut her off financially, like kind of out of nowhere, and like was making up all these excuses about like where money was. And she was just like, she's like, it took me a while to realize that. But once I realized that illusion of like, he's a good person, he's still doing these things. Like he does, she's like, it all went down because this bank account was created a year before. Like, you know what I mean?
Wow.
And he made these, he was acting this way. And she's like, I didn't see it immediately. She's like, but now, because we were talking in the healing, like as she was healing, but she was like, that moment was like the wait. Somebody who actually cares doesn't go out and create a secret bank account.
Exactly. And not a year out ahead, that he'd been deceiving her for that full year. Here is she thought he was invested and there was no investment at all. He was already had an out and he was working on it. Yep. And it's a great example of that. Yeah.
But sometimes I think once you can see like the really erroneous thing, you're like, okay, I got that one. And now I can look at some of the little ones that I may have gaslit myself into thinking was not what I'm saying it was, but it actually was now at this point.
Exactly.
You can see the bad one. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Then you can start to see all the subtle ones, and that even gets more painful when you start to see the subtle ones.
Yeah, those are the worst.
Yeah. So I have an online course, and actually the workbook is the course in a mini. So it's a pared down version of the course. So you don't need the course, but if you want to get the videos and more of it, it's called First Steps to Leaving a Narcissist. But if you just are looking for a support now, then the workbook is the same title, First Steps to Leaving a Narcissist. And you can find that on my website at kerrymcavoyphd.com. And I'm soon, this next year, I'm going to be launching Breaking a Trauma Bond with Cognitive Dissonance, how to resolve the cognitive dissonance and break the trauma bond. And Lisa, Sunny, and I are going to be offering a 12-week live group coaching session that's going to be early 2025. So that should be really great for those who look for accountability, who want to have the community support, but also then want to have live interactions, be able to get, live examples and useful tactics and skill building experience.
That sounds awesome.
But you can find out everything about me at kerrymcavoyphd.com.
And I'll put your links, and I'll also put your podcast in the show notes too, and your YouTube. So
thank you for that.
And hear more.
I appreciate that.
More about what you do and how you explain it. Because like I said at the top, like this was how I found you. You were the first person kind of talking about this in digestible terms. And I think it's a tough topic, which is why 120 something episodes and I've never talked about it. So
you should talk about it more because it's the one that whenever I talk about it on my podcast, it's always the one that people are the most interested in.
Yeah.
I think because it hits this is what Sandra Brown said, and I agree. I certainly experienced it too. It's the most agonizing piece of these relationships.
Yeah.
We don't here we're talking about the most distressing piece of the relationship. It's not necessarily the betrayal, so not necessarily the deception. It's the confusion.
Yeah.
So we can't make a decision as long as we're confused.
Yeah. Yeah. We can't feel like ourselves if we're confused.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you,
always
Kerry.
a pleasure. I appreciate this. You're welcome.
Well, and I look forward to doing this again soon.
That would be great.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye.